Maybe? I can't tell. I'm hard of hearing. Okay, I can tell now. We're good. All right. So I'm Mars Ashton, director of the Game Art program, also assistant professor. I've been looking forward to bringing this guy to Michigan, back to Michigan for a long time now. It's a pleasure to introduce Ben Mathis. He's a 3D artist. He has over 10 years experience, over 11 titles shipped that he's worked on. He's going to talk about some of the work that he's been doing recently. And he's also going to appeal to some of the, I guess, career-seeking students in the area as well. So let's hear it.
How's it going? Can everyone hear me through this? Is it projecting? All right. So I was going to divide today into 3 parts. I'm going to spend the first part kind of going through some of the work that I've been doing recently for a company in London called Future Games of London. They make the app Hungry Sharks, and I've been the principal shark modeler for the past 3 years for them. The next stage, I'm going to do a kind of short lecture on color theory, texture variation within both hand-painted and next-gen per pixel games. And then the final section will be kind of a generic career advice, structuring your time at school with the goal of acquiring full-time employment in the area that you want afterwards. Anytime you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and answer. I'm definitely going to have a period at the end where we can have a lot of questions, but don't hesitate if you've got a quick question about something I'm showing or something that I say. I'm just going to start my watch so I don't lose track of the time. So first I would like to ask who here wants to work in interactive video games? Hands raised. Okay. And then for offline rendering, films, TV, comic books, anything else other than games? Everyone else? Okay. Within 3D, what about who here wants to be character artist? Okay. Environment art? Level design? Programmers? Programmers? Okay. All right. That gives me a good idea. So we've got a good mix. So the first, I want to show a few of the assets that I made for the game. And then I'm going to show one that I have all of the stages from what they give me, how I do my process for creating the art itself, and then how I turn it in at the end to get approval. So the game is a side scroller. You use your finger to direct on the screen where you want the shark to swim, and the generic goal is to eat everything on the screen, and you collect points and in-game coins that you can then unlock better sharks. You can, in the new game, unlock baby sharks that will follow you and eat the things you might have missed, as well as you can add things to your shark like hats, necklaces, piercings on the fins, rocket packs, some of which add functionality, some of which are just cosmetic. So the first version, or the previous version of the game was called Hungry Sharks Evolution. It was a small team of, I would say, 15, 20-ish, located in London. They were able to get 25 million downloads and a significant profits from the game. So Ubisoft decided to buy them out, pre-fund Hungry Sharks World, which is the most recent one that shipped in December. And they wanted it bigger, more things to buy, more content, make it an Ubisoft-sized game instead of an independent-sized game. So this is one of the largest sharks in the game that can be unlocked by getting enough stuff. It is just over 5,000 triangles, which is the largest triangle count of any of the sharks in the game, and all of them are authored at 2048, but in the game they use 1024, and it's really only 2 textures. There's a diffuse map, a normal map, and a specular map, but the specular map is embedded in the blue channel of the normal, and then the game just uses an algorithm to calculate the blue channel again and extract the specular map and use it. So it's just 2 RGB maps. Now I have, this was one of the first sharks that was done for this new game. I didn't have the most recent version of the Photoshop file, so the eyes and the teeth are not correctly, but just want to give you some of the, I'll show you mesh flow. Some of them are very exaggerated, like figuring out how this jaw would open with so little actual room for a jawbone was interesting, but since it's 3D and we can do whatever we want, we made it work. This one. So, and also as I've worked on it, I can see that we've basically started with some more modern sharks that actually exist in the ocean, and as time has gone by, we've started working on more elaborate or potentially extinct. So this is our great white, which is one of the first big sharks you can unlock in the game. And then one of the most recent ones that I did is one of my favorites. This is based on a heliocorp, which is a extinct shark, and it actually uses, let me change this. So it has bandsaw teeth that rotate in the game, and it actually has, if I hide them, the gums have the space for the teeth to, rotate around inside. So the concept artist, Johanna, she's extremely talented, and you can really see from the previous game to this game, when they got a dedicated concept artist and picked really well, her style is perfect for the game, that the style of the game has really skyrocketed. It looks a lot more professional, and for me as the 3D artist, it's a lot more fun to work on her assets than the ones previously. So now I want to show you one that I have all the steps for. So this is a concept from Johanna. This is just 2D on a plane. And all of these assets have now been finished. Started with a carpet shark. Can't remember the name of this one. The white one, Ichycanthus, something like that. Leopleurodon is the green Loch Ness monster. And then the far right was the initial version of the heliocorp. So you can kind of see the evolution of the jaw. This is very similar to what the real prehistoric version looked like. It just had a bit of a spiral jaw, but it was still open and closed like normal, and then it, through the revisions, turned into the saw version. So this is what I normally get from them. They ask for, because I'm a remote artist, I'm not a contractor or a salaried employee, I will, when they give me this Leopleurodon is the one I'm going to show the process for. They give me this drawing and say, how long is it going to take, when will you have it done by, and what is it going to cost us? So I tell them, here's how long, here's how much it costs. They sign this contract, we're all in agreement, and I start only after I've gotten it back signed. So with the concept, the first thing that I do is I make a high poly version. This is not, sorry. And I thought I had this prepared before today. Just gonna find the right, here we go. So I actually have never really taken to Mudbox or ZBrush. I prefer using a subdivision surface process. I very often use what's called a double turbo smooth workflow. So I have one turbo smooth that is set to respect smoothing groups. So I turn it off, you can see the hard lines are in the same place. So for example, this hard line here is not altered in any way other than becoming more smooth along the perpendicular with the first turbo smooth. And then the second one does not have the smoothing groups. And the reason this is done is it allows me to have a much lower sub-D cage. This is the version where all of these points have been cut or moved or created by me, and then everything above it is smoothed by the way these things are set. So with, it allows things like if I, You can kind of see on some of these, like this jawline has a very nice flat facets, which is what allows it to kind of keep these shapes, and the ones that don't have it are much more smoother and subtle. So it's not as beneficial in organics, although I still use it, but in hard surface models, like a very smooth chest plate that you want to put a dent in or a logo or something, I find this way of modeling is much faster than having one turbo smooth with several divisions set to it and then having to actually have a much more dense sub-D cage to hold that detail. And I have a tutorial for this on my website, which is www.poopinmymouth.com, so please visit and check it out. You can see some of the things on the side are also like this. So the next thing that I do when I feel that this, if you look at how it lines up with the ortho, it is pretty much a perfect silhouette. You can't see really any of the concept anymore. It's covered like this. Also, for ease of use, or ease of modeling, the fins are always in some variation of 5-degree rotations and are still perfectly perpendicular to the direction of travel. And what that lets me do is when I want to work on the flippers, I can create a duplicated instance, look at it in, and I keep always my rotation snaps set to 5 degrees. So now you can see this fin is directly up and down, and that now allows me to make changes to this. And if I, for example, if I select like this, because it's straight up and down, I know I got the vertex on the other side as well. And if I want to move it around, if I move like this, I know that I'm moving in the plane of the fin, and you can see that kind of below that the piece from the version that is still in the 45-degree angle is moving as well, but it is moving, in the plane of the fin, so it's a lot easier to model. Very often we'll have, a version of the arm that's in the 45-degree, and then another one that's off and straight up and down, because it makes it much easier to model that way. After I have the high poly matching up with the low poly, I also want to look at it in all directions to make sure there's no pinches or kinks that aren't going to look good once I bake the normal map. I make a duplicate, delete the top turbo smooth, and then starting from this version, collapse edges, get my low poly of the amount that I know I have for this asset in the game. I do not yet use any topology tools. I find in Max I'm as fast as I need to be for turning things in and making a profit, so I haven't really, other than some scripts and tools within Max, I don't use TopoGun or anything else like that. Once I have the low poly, move the diffuse real quick. So if I make this X-ray and show the high poly, you can see that there's a very similar volume. You can see you can do either one, and they end up basically being almost exactly the same volume. Just one is only 4,500 triangles. So I get the low poly created. I do my UV maps. I do all of my UV mapping in Max, with the exception if I have something extremely complicated that Max's relaxed algorithms aren't able to use. I also use, it's called Unfold 3D Magic. It's really no longer available to buy, but I still have a working version. And it does really well for extremely complicated, dense meshes that you have problems getting distortion free. But I haven't used that on any of the sharks for this game because they're low enough resolution, and the way the UV chunks are split, there's not much problem. So I can show you how the UVs are laid out on here. So I try and keep as few splits as possible. You can see on the model with the green behind the ortho, so you aren't distracted. So you can see with the green where the splits are. The whole thing is mirrored down the top. Normally I like to put a little bit of asymmetry in most games, but because this is a side scroller, you really never see it front on, so it doesn't make any sense to lose texture space for that. But one thing that might not be covered at this level is probably your focus for getting things in the game is on triangle count. And this is a very simplistic way of keeping track of the complexity of a model. As a lot of people say, keep it under this triangle count. But it gets more complicated than that. You can, for example, how your triangle strips work can affect the draw calls of the asset, how many materials you have applied to it, and also how many UV splits. So every time you have a UV split, both of the vertices on either side of the split are counted as separate vertices that the game has to manipulate and keep track of. So if you have lots and lots of UV splits, you've got an asset that takes up more processing power to move around the screen and deform with a skeleton than one that has fewer. So I try and be very smart about where I put the splits to have as few as possible while still making it easy to texture. And also try and keep things as often as possible right side up. The exception here is this flipper. The main large flipper is kind of upside down at an angle, but the back flipper is left to right. The head is, the eyes are at the top. It's an easy to understand orientation. Same thing with the body. And this is because most of the time I do my texturing in body paint, so I'm texturing in 3D. But even in body paint, I'll look at the 2D projection. Sometimes I have to have it in Photoshop. And I find, if you have a face that's right side up and it looks like a face, if you need to do edits, everything makes sense because we look at faces right side up. If you've rotated it upside down and at 45 degrees and it's down in the corner, it's going to be very hard to paint on unless you rotate the canvas the right way and you introduce problems. So I always try and have them as oriented correctly as possible. So after that, I take the low and the high into X normal. Is everyone who is familiar with X normal? It's a baking program. There are you can do it in Max. You can do it in the Marmoset tool bag has a really interesting baker now I've been wanting to check out, but don't use that yet. I like X normal because of its lists. So if I start it up, X normal. So it makes it very easy. Most of the time I have a high and a low, and that's what I'm baking. But if you have something like a character with armor, and the armor pieces are separate sub-elements, you can export them as separate objects, and then in XNormal very quickly by ticking and unticking, you can have all of them visible and bake your ambient occlusion layer, but then turn off the armor and bake the normals from the low poly body from the high poly body, and then turn on the armor. So it makes a really easy way of having your lists. So here you can see I've got a few different high poly in the list, some low. You can have different settings. And also the maps to render. A lot of these maps can help with how you're going to make your final texture. For example, I think it was Dota or maybe one of the other ones, but there was a PDF going around the internet that showed their process of how they made the textures, because they use lots of outsourcers and freelancers and people in-house of various experience levels, and they wanted to make sure all the textures look the same. So they had this process of bake out your ambient occlusion, bake out an edge map, combine them like this in Photoshop, and so then even though there was hand-painted texturing in the diffuse, the final assets almost all look the same because they had this process. So depending on how you're doing it, it can be very interesting to do convexity maps or direction maps or curvature maps, and use those in your Photoshop when you're combining your final to make your texture. So because I use this sub-D process, my normal maps when I baked are very high level surface details, muscles, big wrinkles in skin, big wrinkles in clothing, but never things like the waffle pattern of the sweater or the scales on a creature, because if you have a sculpting workflow like Mudbox ZBrush, that can be very easy to stamp on, but I dislike the complexity of the model. You really have to get up into the millions. Then you have giant OBJ files that you might have to transfer to people later in the pipeline. Baking takes a lot longer, and you have the possibility that you've made higher frequency detail on your high poly, then the final texture map will actually hold. For example, if you put pores on the character's face, and then you go to bake, and the texture map is only a 512, those pores might disappear, so you've wasted your time. Whereas if you make your diffuse map and you use photo overlays or a texture brush, or however you make the pores on that 512, if they show up in that size texture, and then you use a 2D black and white to normal conversion, you know it will hold because you're starting at that map resolution. So I like to do it like that. So when I do my bake, this is the normal. So the first thing that starts out, I have a couple layers. So I end up getting my initial bake, and you can see this is very, very smooth. There's no real detail to it at all. There's a few baking errors where it picked up parts of the fin for here. So I often do a couple of bakes in different radiuses rather than bothering with cage settings and all of that. I just find it faster. And then afterwards, once I've got my diffuse fairly set and I'm happy with it, I come up with fine details, prints on sweaters, pores on skin, scales on whatever, and use Crazy Bump to do the conversion between the overlay on the diffuse and creating a normal map that I can add on. The diffuse I do in body paint, and so at the beginning I start with a pure projection of the texture, so you can of the concept, so you can see there are places where the edges of the concept don't project, or the eyes were in the way, or this part of the forehead blocked here, or the teeth, or there's lots of things that are missing. The other sides of the fins, underneath of the belly where the fin blocks. So then the next stage is to go in and be able to paint all of the missing. So here, this is one layer that adds in all of the missing portions. I go in and do things like teeth, there's the mouth interior and the tongue, some overlays, and then this is the fine alligator skin overlay that then made it into the specular map. So I will now apply the final shader. Has anyone heard of the Zoliol shader for 3D Studio Max? Starts with an X, X-O-L. So it was made by two guys. One is technical something or other at splash damage, and I forget what the other guy does. But this is a really nice shader for 3D Studio Max that lets you have a color normal spec. You can have a global opacity while still maintaining specular, so that's perfect for the frames of glasses. So you want to be able to see through but still have the reflection. There's not a way to do that out of the box in Max in real time. And you have a really cool setting called half Lambert. So here if you see the whole asset, it's very kind of goes to black shadows, and with it turned on, only the shadows are lifted. And what that is, the programmers, please forgive me for this rudimentary explanation, but normally you have on a sphere with a Lambert or a shader, if something is facing the light, it's a 1, and then as it faces away from the light, it's a 0. And that's how you go from white to black. But you can go in and you can manipulate that. So what a half Lambert is it says facing the light is still 1, but full black is more like a 0.8. So the first portion of the shading is identical. It's only the back half that's kind of lifted up. And you can even separate that into red, green, and blue channels. It's a very cheap per pixel operation. And this is, for example, how they did, they called it the gummy shader for Ratatouille. So they did a presentation at GDC where they showed the fruit rendered with just diffuse Lambert textures, very dead looking. None of the grapes looked like they were filled with juice. The cheese didn't look like it was real, anything like that. So then they showed a same picture with that with RenderMan's subsurface scattering and translucency and all the advanced settings turned on. Okay, now the things look very nice. The cheese is squishy and lets some light in. The milk is transparent. The grapes are filled with juice, but in a realistic way. And this was not what they wanted, and this is not what the movie looks like. So they created what they called gummy lights, where they could change the dot product for red, for green, and for blue. And they were able to make these edits to have these glowy almost like gummy bear fruit-looking shaders that all the fruit in Ratatouille had on. And we had at CCP for a while a shader where we could adjust that for all the assets in the game. And when I go to talk about the color theory, we'll come back to that a little bit. So once I have the this version with the color, normal, and spec, and I'm happy with it, I have to make a version of the normal map where the specular is embedded in the blue channel, which then no longer renders correctly in Max because I don't have their proprietary shader. And I collapse everything, make sure there's no floating vertices, all the faces are on material ID 1, everything's on the same smoothing group unless it's not supposed to be, reset X form, like all the things so that there's a clean file. When they open, the animator can start editing and there's not weird leftover high poly objects over here, or missing vertices or unwelded things. So that's something that is important, especially if you're a remote artist. You want your stuff to be usable right away. And then I find out from them if it's acceptable or if I need to do changes, and then I can turn in my invoice and get paid. So there's been probably around 20, 25 sharks done like this. The highest detail ones take around a week, and then below that there are some that only take 3 days, and then even smaller assets like the penguins you can eat or the people or whatever are one-day objects. Okay, any quick questions on that before I go to color theory and material types? Oh, sorry, I wanted to show one other. This is not yet done. I'm still in the process of making this one, but this is my most current asset. So as the game progresses, there's no teeth or tongue yet, but as the game progresses, we're getting more and more kind of crazy and elaborate sharks. So this is the sub-D version, and actually if I go down to the cage without everything else turned on, it's really not that high poly of an object. It's just using some of these smoothing groups and the double smooth to get like these results. Another quick thing to say that I just thought about this, when you're modeling, if you find yourself doing certain commands over and over and over, write them down, put a little tick mark every time you do them, and the ones that have lots and lots of tick marks by, make hotkeys, add things to your quad menu or your right click, put a button somewhere. If you have to go into the menu every time for everything in Photoshop and Max, the people who don't have to do that are going to be way faster than you, and they're going to be kept when you get let go at the end of a project or when they don't have enough money. So I'm going to okay, so I actually saved the wrong PSD, so I had to grab the texture from this from my website, so it still has some overlays, and it didn't have the opacity embedded, so his eyes do not work right, so they just look kind of cataracts, and the opacity on the hair. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about this is texturing, whether you're doing hand painted. So right now this is with no lighting. This is full bright. If I turn the shading on, you can see a little bit of vertex illumination, and then with it turned off, it just goes bright. So this is what I like doing better. I like fully bright. All the lighting has been painted in. I don't really like per pixel next gen. I find it too scientific and not artsy enough. I like the painting from old school textures. But regardless of if you're doing these kind of hand painted or per pixel, being able to do convincing texture work is knowing how materials behave. So you can learn this through a lot of different ways, but even doing next gen stuff, there's now this kind of temptation to, you can kind of formalize it, make it very formulaic. Okay, I start with a photo that I took, make sure it's without distortion, cloudy day, so there's not really direct light. I use these plugins to make a normal map off of it. I figure out how to make a specular map, and now I have this realistic looking material. The problem is you very often have to make something that is aesthetically pleasing. And if all you know is kind of like how to emulate something that's real rather than how to create it, you're always going to be without those tools to make something that looks the way that you want. So it's really important to examine how does an object shine, how is the roughness or the smoothness of the surface, how is it reflective, what is the base color of it. This is also really important. How many people have heard of physically based rendering, PBR? Okay, so this is probably something you're having to learn now for asset creation. It's definitely something you're going to have to use if you're working on a large-scale AAA studio. Almost all of them are doing this. This attempts to bring it into a very formulaic pattern, like everything that is concrete has these values and everything that's metal has these values. And it's a way to try and get things that are consistent so that if you go from a level that's lit like this with kind of one point light and everything else is dark, and then you go outside to a gray, cloudy day, that you still have a consistent, it still looks like metal, it still looks like whatever. So one of the ways that I tried to learn how to do texturing, I had my first game class, and the professor showed us how to model, and then I said, okay, but how does texturing work? And he showed us how the bevel and emboss layer effects works in Photoshop, and that was our texturing lesson. So we knew how to add shadows and highlights to make tank panels. And I said, well, what if I want to make a face or hair or a shirt with wrinkles on it? And he didn't really have any advice. So I went home and went on the internet and looked. Okay, so that reminds me of another question. I want you to raise your hand if you have at least one person who does the career that you imagine yourself doing, that you only know from the internet. You like their work, you look up to the stuff they're doing. Oh my gosh, this is the most hands I've ever seen in a lecture. So good job for you. Most of the time I get 0, maybe 1. And then I ask, okay, if we go to the music university next door, do you think no one would have a favorite guitarist or band? If we went to the film school, do you think no one would have a favorite director or director of photography or anything like that? So it's really good to see what are people who are already working in the industry, what is the quality of the work that they're doing? What are they doing in their free time? What is the style that they're working on at their job? What does the wireframes look like? What do their UV layouts look like? What do their textures look like? Because these are people who are already working at the level that you want to work at, so you can learn directly from them if you keep good folders of inspiration for how things look. So when you want to know, like, okay, how do I make a suit of armor for a game that doesn't have shaders? So I've got to paint everything so that it looks like metal that's shiny, that reflects. And we used to have to do that. I mean, there's still mobile games that do it, but most games had no reflectivity, and every frame does a new calculation of what it's reflecting. You just had to be able to paint something that looked like metal armor. So you open up a picture of a steel teapot, and you go and try and find some pictures of real armor and see what are the rules like. What happens, why do you have dark areas when it's bright steel? Okay, it's reflecting dark areas from the room. Where can I put those dark areas on an asset that's going to be moving around and animating so that they don't look wrong? I mean, they're going to look wrong, but in the least wrong way possible so that it still looks like a suit of metal armor. Where can I put my edges so that it doesn't look like pieces of metal are bending, or do I need to separate it to a second object or have another bone? So a really good game that's done good material separation is Witcher 3. There was an art dump from one of the main character artists on Polycount, and he showed the ZBrush sculpts in high resolution, close-ups, and then also the assets in whatever engine they were using at the highest resolution textures. None of the things in the game looked this good, but this was the person who authored them trying to show them off for future work, accolades, that kind of thing. So you could really see. And one of the best ones was this suit of quilted cotton with pieces of leather straps sewn on it. And the quilted cotton had no specularity whatsoever. There was maybe a little bit on the little threads that crossed back and forth, but the pillows of the cotton had nothing. There was no shine whatsoever. But then these strips of leather had the appropriate specular reaction to the light because they were metal, they were shiny, they had been coated with oil. So being able to do textures means knowing how do these things change. So if I have to paint it from scratch, where do I put the highlights? Where do I put the shadows? What color should the shadows be so that it reads as skin instead of hair, instead of metal? How bright should I start with you know, the initial color to help the most. Like for example, when I'm doing gold, I actually start with a very dark brown because I like to put in all the highlights and where things are shining and where it's reflecting so that the base color is dark brown, which doesn't seem like it makes that much sense if you're trying to make something shiny and brilliant and bright yellow to start with dark brown, but I find for my texturing process that that works really well. With skin, you very often want to start with kind of your, not your shadow color, but your kind of slightly darker than the middle, your middle gray shade, and the saturation that you want to sell that ethnicity of the skin that you're trying to make. A lot of it is trial and repetition. Maybe you can see here on these jeans, because denim has very little specularity. I've tried to do nothing but making it brighter in the directions that would face the light. But then here on the candy cane, I've painted in a specular highlight. It doesn't move because it's painted in, but it hopefully makes it look like this hard, shiny candy surface as opposed to a dry, non-reflective denim surface. Or if you put highlights on the little metal grommets, then that hopefully makes it say that this is something shinier or more reflective. Same thing with the eyes. These are now supposed to look wet, so you get, you know, sharp highlights on them. Black metal. I mean, mainly I find it's the difference in how the specularity works, but you also, between how transparent or opaque a surface is, you have to pay attention to the shadows and what the shadow colors do, because that's what's going to sell a glass of milk versus a white waxy candle versus a white marble statue versus a solid white piece of something that has no transparency or opacity to it. So it's really kind of knowing the skills of old master illustration, where you're painting everything from scratch on a flat canvas and you're trying to sell, this is the lighting, this is the time of day, this is what the shadows were like, was it a point light, a fire, a big bright window, what is this metal, how shiny is it, how rough it is, if I knocked on it, what sound would it make? So it's not as formulaic as coming up with, you know, the diffuse, the normal, the specular, and then this is going to sell the material type. And there's a kind of temptation to approach it like this now that we're doing per pixel, because you do separate it out to these in reflection and opacity and glow and everything else. And you do need to know how these different parts work, but the end result is to see all of them collapse together, interacting in real time on the asset, so that the player decides, okay, that part of his armor is metal, that part of her hair is bleached or brittle, that part of his shoe is leather, and then that part is suede. Because that's your goal, is to be able to sell the material types that the character is supposed to have, or that the trash can is made out of, or that the lighting that the environment is trying to give you in your illustration. Also, you are going to be trying to learn how these colors interact with an asset as a whole. So for example, when I start an asset, I like to do flood fill colors. So just solid blue for the jeans, and then solid navy for the sweater, and then the solid skin color for the hair, or for the face, and then the hair. And get all of them in with solid colors, and then look at it, because that will kind of help you to see, like, okay, this red for the shirt is off for the color that I want the pants to be. Or these two parts are really bright, and so this person's skin color is getting lost, and I really wanted it to be obvious that they're super pale, or they're super tan, or they're super orange, or something like that. So having it start with solid colors lets you work on the actual color theory of it. So even before you tried to make the textures realistic, where is the attention going? Is it supposed to be, what is the main female character's name from Overwatch with the orange pants? Tracer. So if you look at her, despite the fact that she has long legs and a bright orange, they're clearly not a visual focus point. The attention on the character is up here. She's got the puffy jacket, she's got the cool glasses. Most of the visual detail is here. Her boots have some to give you a second focal spot, but you're clearly supposed to keep the attention up here. And that was done in the design, in the color theory, and how the texture was done, the brightness. All of those steps we're following in. So the concept artist had to know, how do I do the design so that your attention is up here? Or for another character, so that the attention is more out in the arms. The 3D artist had to know how to follow up with that design to add it in. If there was a separate texture artist, or when the 3D artist did the texture, they had to know how to also reiterate that with where they made things dark, bright, specular, not specular, reflective, all those kind of things. And then the animator as well. Am I going to ruin this whole design by making her legs always, go like this and the rest of the body is very stiff? That's working against the design that was done in the 2D part. So when you're learning how to do texturing, if that's part of your work set, really try and understand how the materials work in real life, so that if someone asked you, what does copper do? You can say, well, the diffuse color, the non-lit, fully bright color is around brighter than middle gray or darker than middle gray. The whole thing is orangish, but when it reflects, it tends to be more yellow reflections. When it has dark spots, they tend to be more reddish. Very often it's hammered, so you need these kind of like concave facets on it. It tends to get a bit rusted when things, you want to be able to describe it without any visuals in front of you. When you're making the textures, you should have lots of reference in front of you, but your goal is to understand, how does wax work? How does hair work? How does metal work? So that regardless of if you're painting it from scratch, if there's no texture at all and it's just a solid color, it's vertex based, it's per pixel, you understand how those materials work so that you can make it for that particular games. Because if you're a slave to a formula, I take this photograph, I run it through this filter, I get this thing. If your pipeline changes, if the art style changes, if you move on to another company that does things a different way, you're going to be lost because you only have memorized this formula instead of understanding how do the materials work. And the best way to learn that, besides observation and practice, is to look at a lot of more traditional art books. So I have a list of books on my website that I think are very good. There's a really good color theory book by Joseph Itten. There's a few good drawing books, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. The follow-up book called Color by the same artist. There's some books by Harvey Brown, who's a pastel artist who goes into color theory and how it works in drawings very well. And these are all for purely 2D artists. None of them have anything to do with video games in any way whatsoever. But they cover the concepts of color theory, of materials, of illustration, of lighting, of composition, and all of these things come into character art, environment art, and the best character artists, the best environment artists, the best level design, the best lighters, they understand these concepts deeply, and they very often have multiple fields that they work in. For example, I really like photography. I have real lights that are battery powered so that if I want to go out to the beach and break how the sunlight is working so that I can light this person's face from here. I can set up and I can know if I want a small soft box or a silver umbrella or a giant white parabolic reflector. And before doing that, I had no idea when I would want to change the field of view on my lenses in 3D. Why would I want wide? Why would I want narrow? What do they do? I didn't know anything about lighting. I just kind of would use point lights, and that's how it works. Now I know about the softness of light, the relative apparent size based on distance, roughnesses of surface, and all of that came from photography. So some people might be more interested in traditional oil painting and level design, or maybe they do photography and character art, or maybe they do sculpting in clay and they're a texture artist. But these things then give you multiple ways to look at the same thing so that you start having a deep fundamental understanding instead of a more surface, I do this and then I do that and then I get the result out of it. Any questions about this stage, the color theory, material types? Okay, so now I will. Yeah?
So when painting a texture, of course, you have to consider what generally is going to be in the shade and what generally will be lit. Occasionally, the character might lift their arm and something might take a shadow look unnatural. Mm-hmm. How do you so it has to be moved to some degree. How do you find a balance between portraying that shade and also account for, well, sometimes it will look bad in this situation, like what rules of you?
Yeah. There's really no hard and fast rule. You start to kind of learn rough idea. Like for example, you can see the darkest spot is really between the crotch, and that's because the only way that could ever break is if he was somehow some like character that could lift his leg all the way up to here and hold it and move around the room, and then you would see, did he pee his pants? Why is it so dark down there? But most of the time, walking around, so you need that darkness to really imply the roundness of the legs and that the butt overhangs and shadows and the crotch and all the different interactions. But you're right in that the arm is much different in that you very often have it going up. But there are times when you just can't fix it. Like a good example is Kingdom Hearts. They do this very classic, bright, darker to give this cel-shaded look. And very often, like the Merlin character from Sword in the Stone in one of the games, when he was moving his hands around, it was just constantly breaking where the shadow sides were facing up towards the light and the light were facing down. And it still worked because of how well executed the assets were, but it was breaking anyway. So you kind of have to, a little bit is from experience, a little bit of it is from testing. Like one of the things we had really well on, I worked on the Wild West game Gun at Neversoft, and we had a tool where we could export from our computer. We had a PlayStation 3 dev kit on our desk, and we could press a button, and not only would the asset update, but we also had a way to play as any character as the main character. So you could load up an NPC that you're working on, make them the main character so that they hold the gun, so that they can ride the horse, so you can run them over into the shadow and then into the highlight. And then at any time you could pause and then say like, oh, that's not really working. Go into Photoshop, make some changes, save, export, hit the button, and it updates. And you're like, okay, this is much better. But then if he goes back down, you're like, maybe I took it a little bit too much. And so you could really polish for in the game. And that's actually really important to try and work in the most similar final environment as possible. So if you do everything in 3D Studio Max with it zoomed up in the screen with your favorite shader with 32 passes and it looks great, but it's going into a game that has none of that stuff, it's not going to look right. In fact, it might actually look terrible even if it looks great in Max. So I like using this Zoliol shader for the sharks because we have a shader in the game that uses the half Lambert. So this, I don't have the exact shader, but I have one very close. So far I've never made anything that looks good on my computer with that they give me a screenshot from the game and going, oh, this shading doesn't work when he goes into a cave, so brighten it up or something like that. So you need to both practice and see how it looks. Most of the time it's this kind of top-down, very diffuse lighting where all the shadows are underneath of surfaces but are still kind of vague and not very hard-edged. But there are people who make art style work where they do have hard shadows under the nose or the eyebrows and it still works in the game. So it's a bit of practice, it's a bit of experience, and it's a bit of like looking at it in the game and then watching and saying, okay, well this breaks, but it breaks the least often that I think I can get it to work for the amount of tech that I have at my disposal.
All right, thank you.
You talked about how this way of doing it with like common on like smaller developers and mobile developers. So for big studios, do they tend to not put any of the shading at all to diffuses, or do they put like a little bit, like mostly stuff the lights and the scenes?
Yeah, it's really differs from studio to studio. So for some games, they have a very stylistic preference that involves having some baked-in lighting. Most of the time, it ends up being even more vague than this, like a kind of generic ambient occlusion, like crevices get darkened and flat surfaces are bright. But then other things like, they might have some kind of cell shading that really needs to have almost no lighting whatsoever. So it's normally kind of elaborated to you by whoever set the style when you start working on the asset. They'll be like, okay, here's our target asset, this one is already done and it looks exactly how we want. And then you can look at it and be like, okay, oftentimes there'll be a PSD that you can look at and say, oh, okay, here's an overlay layer that's the ambient occlusion bake at 50%. Or maybe it's a totally separate map that the shader is able to overlay. Like I'm pretty sure the Crytek engine is able to, you give it an actual ambient occlusion separate map that it blends in on the shader based on lighting and everything like that. It's very often set by style and how good the rendering engine and the shaders are. So for example, the more realistic the lighting and the better, the more accurate it is, the less shading you have to put in the diffuse map. And then the crappier the rendering engine is, the more you have to put in. And then also with the style, the more realistic the style is with no real stylistic intentions, the less lighting is baked in. And then the more stylized that it is, the more color changes in the shadows, or shadows will be present at all. So it's not really something that can be like set 100%. It's kind of per game. All right, so I think I might have eaten up almost all the time, but I'll try and go through as much as I can of kind of career advice. So the first thing that I would say is you should get a website going as soon as you can, because one of the things that Google weights towards search engine optimization is the age of the website. So I've had my website, my URL, since 2001, so I have a really nice age on mine. And I had a really good professor who made us turn in all of our projects by website. He wouldn't look at JPEGs. There was no place on the internet or on the network to place the files. You gave him your URL at the beginning of the class, and when the projects were due, he would go to the URL. If it wasn't there, you got a 0, and if it was there, he would do the grading based on that. And it was to get you used to presenting your work to others in a way that was easily accessible, because you have to do that. You are never going to be able to have a chance where the very first time and the only times you're doing the application, you're physically there with your work on the device that you're in control of to show the person. Very often your first application, when someone sees your website or sees your work, is going to be with a website. So having practice knowing what designs work, what's easy to update, how do I put the art there so that it gets seen right away instead of buried under 10 clicks, is really good to get used to so that you have something to update. And you have this way to very quickly send something to someone. You don't have to try, I got to put a new PDF together, or I need to export my latest demo reel, or you've got a website that at any time you can send someone the URL and show them what kind of work that you're doing. And if you're in a practice of constantly updating it, you have your latest work on it. So this is probably the longest time that I've gone without updating my website or putting anything on it. And it's just because I have a 2-year-old now that takes up a lot of my time. And I've had a very consistent job that I haven't thought about leaving. So there's not really been a reason to polish my latest work. And with the kid, I haven't had time to do very many new tutorials, which was also often how I would update my website. This is probably my 6th or 7th iteration of my website, and I had the same version for several years, and the biggest problem was that it didn't have a mobile version. It wouldn't really work on, you just got the exact same version whether you were on a computer or a phone, and it didn't have enough of the kind of like built-in tags that Google spiders could kind of dig in and find out, okay, this is a picture, okay, this is a different web page. I had some that I'd manually put in, like headers and alt image tags, but this one comes from some kind of template that my husband helped me put together, and has like the ways to be able to put things together. So one of the things that I like a lot is showing, where do I have my actual resume? That should be easier. Here we go. So for example, I am 99% positive I was the first person who started putting actual little thumbnails of ship title boxes on the resume page, and now it's fairly common to do that. And I like that because this is one of the things that gets you past the gatekeepers. So you're the first person you send your application to who sees it is not the art director, it's not an artist of any type, it's someone in human resources. And someone in human resources gets big gaga eyes when they see experience, ship titles, titles that they've heard of, titles that have sold really well. It doesn't even matter if they can't examine your work or know how good you are, because your goal here is to get past that gatekeeper and have your work passed to someone who can evaluate it. So for example, I got to do 8 hours of work on Astroneer before it shipped, which is probably the least amount of time that you can do on a project and still claim that you worked on it. And I'm absolutely going to put a cover shot of that game on my resume. Anyone who actually works in 3D would understand that I didn't really contribute very much to the game. It was a very short process. But a human resources person would be like, oh, this game blew up. It's, everyone's talking about it. I want someone who worked on that to work here, so send it on to the art director. Because if you have to think, the people who you're competing with are not your peers. How many art schools are there graduating programmers, 3D artists, just in the United States? There's thousands of them, and each of them graduates, at least 10 people every semester, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands. And in addition to them, you're not just competing with people who graduated the same year as you or 6 months before. You're competing with people like me who might be switching jobs, or their team got closed down, or the publisher decided not to go ahead, and now 50 people are laid off who have decades of experience and a much longer resume. So you want to be able to do everything you can to be a attractive candidate. You want your stuff to be looked at by the artists. And because of the sheer volume of applications, they don't send the things directly to the artists. They have the human resources. That's their job. Look at all of it and take out the very obvious garbage. Try and find the stuff that's worth taking up some of the time of the artists who have work to do. So anything you can do to get past that. That's why I try very much to list my ship titles, what platforms they were for, links to the Metacritic scores. For whatever reason, people care about that, when if you're a 3D artist, you have nothing to do with how good the game was and how many people would buy it or why it was reviewed, but a lot of hiring managers care about Metacritic scores. Industry experience, I tried to write at each company what I was responsible for so that it becomes clear whether I was remote, in-house, what I did. Different times I've been in magazines or on front pages of CG Talk or things like that, and then they actually go to screenshots. No, they should. This one's not updated. Then also like places that I've taught at and what the details were about. And this can sometimes be a little bit awkward because you're thinking, I want my work to speak for itself. Why do I need to sell myself? This self-promotion, I don't really like it. But if you want to be paid for doing your work, you got to get used to doing that, because you want to go from being a student to being an employee. I'm assuming that maybe there's some of you who are independently wealthy. But you just got to figure out what to do with that. And that involves very often learning how to network. And that means the people in your classes, identifying people who have that drive, who are doing good work, and you want to know, what are they working on? What are they doing? Can I ask them questions? Can I show them my work? If we're doing a group project, I want to be on their team because I know they're going to do good work. And if you identify someone who has drive and talent, they're very likely going to get a job. Maybe it's before you and they can help lift you up. Maybe it's after you and that's someone you want to tell your boss about, and a lot of companies have hiring bonuses. You recommend someone, they come to work, make it past 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, you get $5,000 for recommending someone. I've gotten a bonus like that before for recommending a person. So you want to know people who you can recommend. You also want to know people who might recommend you. But you also have to keep in mind these are not chess calculations and people will see through slimy car salesman techniques. So your real motivation should be, I'm an artist and I like art, so I want to know other people who are good artists and like art. And the other stuff is things I'm keeping in mind, but they're kind of icing on the cake. Or I'm a good programmer, I want to know someone who's another good programmer who does things in a different area or even the same as me and I can learn from, or they can learn from me. In addition, once you're working, you really have to keep up the networking as well. Almost all of my contract work comes from people that I've worked with in the past who remember me as the guy who likes doing hard surface high poly modeling, or the person who thinks UV mapping is really fun and I hate it, so I'm going to pay this guy to do my UV mapping for me. So this is, you want to get better at your 3D art or your programming or your animation or whatever it is, but you have to at the same time keep in mind that networking aspect, because it is not a meritocracy. It is not this idea where at all times anyone hiring is aware every single person on earth who does this skill has a way of placing them all on this scale based on salary, experience, and ability, and then picks the very best one. It doesn't work like that at all. It has a lot to do with, who do I know about? Who knew about the job to apply it? Is there someone here who can vouch for them? Are they already in my same city? Do they have a visa to work in my country? Do they speak my same language? How many hours away is the time zone that they're on? Have they worked on a game like this before? Have they worked on a studio this size before? So it has a lot of these things going in, and if you ignore the networking side, if you wait until the last class before you graduate to start doing this, putting yourself out there, putting your work out there, you're doing yourself a major disservice from starting early, getting that history on Google, learning about how best to present your work, because your first website is going to be terrible. I made the mistake of signing up for a free website for my first. I'm not going to give it to you. You might be able to find it if your Google foo is good enough, but it's still up because I've forgotten the login and it's on a free web hosting thing. So it's still up, it still has my work from university. The menu is a picture of myself that has rollover images that change when you put the mouse on. It's really terrible. But I was able to put that up, and I thought it was great when I first made it, and then a few weeks later I realized how terrible it was and started making iterations. So that's your goal. In the same way, you want to do as many projects as you can, you want to get better at your art, you need to get better at presenting your work so that it's in a clear, concise, think about who's going to be looking at it, how are they going to look at it, what are they going to click on first, what do they want to see. For example, if all you ever show is your final version, I don't know if the wireframe is good. I don't know if it will deform well. I don't know how your UV texture layouts are. So you want to think, should I show my UV texture layouts? Should I show my wireframe? Should I show a turntable so that people can see? Should I show it doing a range of motion so that I know how to do, geometry that deforms well in a game? So these kind of things, they don't relate directly to your skill set, but they relate to showing other people that you know how to do it. And in an industry that has a lot of competition and a lot of people applying, this is how you set yourself out from the rest of the crowd so that you're the one who gets that job interview, you're the one who gets that pass along from the human resources to the art director. There was a point I was going to say about that. Maybe it'll come to me. Questions about this while I'm trying to think about it?
Here's I've got one question. So I think that you gave some great career advice. That was fantastic. But one thing that was really playing to my mind is what major piece of advice would you give to any aspiring artist or any person pursuing a creative career? What major motivational advice would you give? Because I'm sure most of us in the room have always considered, is this the right thing for me?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll give two answers to that. So I'm going to try and make sure both thought processes so I don't forget one. I'm getting old. The first is I want to give just a really quick overview of how I got into the industry, and maybe that will give some background. So I loved Reboot and Beast Wars. These were the best. I had every single Beast Wars toy carefully saved in a box to give my son when he's old enough not to break them. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I love computers. I like art. I've never taken an art class, but I liked art. And I was in high school. I was like, I want to make these 3D moving pictures. And then I saw Toy Story and some of the Pixar movies. Like, yes, this is it. So my father found someone who had studied that at the Savannah College of Art and Design, who was willing to sit down with me and give me some advice. He said, well, the best thing I can tell you, first year at any university is exactly the same, art fundamentals. So go somewhere cheap like Virginia Commonwealth, get that out of the way, and then transfer to the expensive private school. So I followed that advice. I went to Savannah my second year. Most of my credits transferred, saved a lot of money that way. And then I took my first animation class finally, and I hated it. I didn't like anything about it. I didn't like the timing. I didn't like the rendering, the waiting to see, and then being like, oh, this doesn't work right, the movement's not right. I didn't like it at all. And I was like, what am I going to do? I'm going to this expensive university. I don't like these projects. I don't see a future for me working in this career. So then I thought, okay, well, maybe there are some specializations within 3D that I'll like. And I really liked anatomy and muscles and life drawing. So I started trying to get into the muscle simulations like you see in Jurassic Park and stuff, where they have a muscle system inside that moves the skin when they land and flexes when they are grabbing things. And this was right when the first systems came out for making muscles that would contract and move the skin in the animation. So I started trying to get into that. And I found that fun, but I wasn't too deep into it. And then over a Christmas break, there was a kind of public art test by one of my favorite concept artists. And anyone could do the the art test, and they were going to hire someone from what the best application was. And it was 2 orthographics of 2 hot women in space boots. It was for one of the Unreal games. And they gave you a triangle count, and all you had to do was make the model. Make the model under this triangle count for these. And I'd never done anything low poly. I wasn't even really aware of the concept. I'd played video games, but I was like, oh yeah, someone has to make these assets, and they're totally different than from film. And over Christmas break, I poured through both of them. You only needed to do one to apply, but I found it so interesting and so much fun. I did both of them and sent them both in. And I didn't get the job, but 3 or 4 years later, I worked with the person who made the decision later, and he got to tell me the background information. He said, we were actually going to hire you. You were the best junior artist. And then we got a guy who'd been working in China for 10 years apply, and not only did he do both of them, he textured both of them, and they were better than our best texture artists, so we hired him. And, but as soon as I finished that, I was like, this is what I want to do. I love low poly. Changing my career, my focus to this from school, and then from there, like all of my projects were in low poly and video game stuff, and moved from there into working in the industry. But as far as motivation, I'm not sure I can give the best advice, because I've always felt a strong motivation to finish things. Like if I get a project idea, I want to take it all the way to completion. So one of the reasons that I like the low poly hand-painted stuff, because you're looking at, say, 3 or 4 days for a character instead of 3 or 4 weeks for a Gears of War character. I mean, some of them took 2 or 3 months to finish. This is longer than my attention span lasts. One of the things that I did early in my career was I started as a junior artist on one of the Lord of the Rings properties from Vivendi. They had the literary rights, and Electronic Arts had the film rights. And the only game that made it out from Vivendi was the Hobbit game, and then a new director of marketing came in and saw how much it would cost to compete with EA's Lord of the Rings games, so they canceled all the projects, including ours. But I was a junior artist, and the senior ones were the ones who got to model the characters. And I had in my mind, I want to be a character artist. I love making things with muscles and anatomy and clothing and body armor. Like I'm not too good to make trees and rocks and environments, but my passion lies in making characters. So I started doing as many characters in my free time as possible, because I didn't get to make them at work. I was like, how am I ever going to get good at this if I don't do it? So I would go on Polycount, CG Chat, and some of the other websites that would have competitions. Because rather than just, okay, come up with an idea, come up with a triangle count, come up with a texture size, come up with all the motivation yourself, or the competition, you had a limitation, what the tech specs needed to be, and the best was other people doing it at the same time. So, oh, look what that person's doing. Oh, they're almost finished. Oh, maybe I want to work with this person next time. That person's stuff is awesome. I want to copy what they're doing. So it gave a lot of motivation to and a deadline, like you've got to get it done by this time. And then sometimes there were prizes, or you might have a studio. Some of these competitions have had studios looking at the final versions, and very often places 1, 2, and 3 end up getting jobs at those studios afterwards. So I find project-based practice is much better than just kind of this ephemeral, oh, I need to do more work, because then you have no deadline. I mean, you can set your own, but if you break it, nothing happens. You can, sky's the limit for tech specs. So having these competitions, and you can find, like Polycount does them all the time, beginner ones, they do environment ones, they do Dominance War, which is the gigantic one. Last time it had, I think, 10 different forums from all over the world to compete. Some of the people didn't even speak English and just had to submit their final images from these Russian forums, and you saw these amazing works that came from aesthetics from different countries that don't have the same culture as ours. And so with the motivation, you really have to figure out how to kind of generate that, because this goes back to this idea of who you're competing with. Because even if I never did personal projects, I've been paid to work 9 to 5 on 3D art for 10 years. So the number of hours that I've been working on practicing this just is going to dwarf any amount that someone who's still in school is going to do, especially if all they ever do is the projects for class. Because if you think that you're going to graduate and your portfolio is going to be filled with the actual projects that you did for school and get a job, the likelihood of that is zero. Because the first time you do a project, it's the first time you've done the thing. There's no way you're going to be good at it. Even if you've got a natural talent or drive or ability to create surfaces or environmental spaces, the second time you do it, you're going to be even better, and the third time even better, and the fourth time even better than that. So the stuff you put in your portfolio should be at least your second attempt, not your projects from school. And that's part of coming up with these motivations, because you need to figure out, okay, my motivation for school, I'm going to get the grade, other people are doing it, maybe people are relying on me, I want the grade, I want to move to the next class. So that helps you get the work done. But you've got to figure out, where am I going to get the motivation to now do it again, to have an even better piece of work for my portfolio. Some people ask me, how many characters do I need in my portfolio? How many environments do I need? And the implication is to get hired as an employee. Like, what do I need? What's the magic number? And I always replied that I think that's the wrong way of asking it. The way you know you have enough to get hired is when you get hired. If you are not getting responses, if you're not getting callbacks, and you are applying and you're sending stuff out, that means you don't yet have the body of work that is tempting these people to give you the callbacks to bring you in for the interviews. So that means I need to make new, more, better work than I have now, so that the next time I send it out, someone goes, oh, okay, that looks like the kind of stuff we could use in our game. So this kind of motivation, figuring out how to do the work, there are people who ask this who have 10 years of experience, because they're like, I'm just doing the same thing over and over at work. I don't really like it. This is not what I want to do anymore. I want to move up to a better studio, or I want to move from junior character artist to senior, or from concept artist to character artist, or whatever. And then they're like, okay, well then I have to do it at home, because this company is not paying me to do it. They don't believe me yet that I can move to do it. So I need to do it at home so that I, A, have examples to show them, and B, if I'm not good enough yet, I can get better to prove to them that I can already do it. And it sucks that very few companies do invest in their employees and give them the time to get better and try and make these plans for moving around. But unfortunately, that's more often the norm, to just pigeonhole you into what you can contribute to, and you do that until you do your own self-training and make the time to then show them how you can move into that area. But unfortunately, that's how it works. Right. Yeah, you first, since you haven't had a run in.
So, like, let me just, I guess, open up some context. So, devices are getting, I guess, better specs all the time, and the hand painted will probably look at gone from the main console to mobile, and pretty soon, you know, mobile games will, I mean, the specs will get even better and better. So, where do you see this kind of thing having a place in the industry? I think it'll always exist in this sort of obvious thing, but like, you see this kind of work for longer?
I tend not to make too many predictions about the game industry, just because I don't really feel it's based much on logic. So I don't really feel like I'm going to be able to get ahead of the craziness. Personally, I think that the hand painting is always going to be there, because it offers this kind of real ability to really control the style. If you paint everything in and you're presenting it at almost fully bright or with a tiny bit of vertex shading, it looks exactly how you authored it. It's never going to look differently. So it really gives a strong ability to control how the assets look. As you said, phones are getting better all the time, but at the same time, the screens are still small. So you need to have things that read well from a distance, in the same way like theater performers. If you ever see them up close, their face makeup is horrendous. It looks like mutant clowns, and it's because from far away, with the theater lighting and how far you are, it still looks like a face, and when they make expressions, you can see it. And that same kind of concept is still going to apply on small screens. And then you also have the fact that every time those devices move up, something new comes up. Like, now we're going to be able to need to make watch games, or maybe the VR devices are the whole console in and of itself, and at first they have shitty GPUs. Or now maybe there are rugs in front of your refrigerator that have game. I don't know. Also, I personally am, me and my family were trying to be financially independent before 40, so I'm not really making projections that far out, so I'm just trying to work as much as I can until then and hope that works out. But I mean, even for like this shark game, I'm not really doing very much hand painting. It's mostly clean up from the missing parts from the texture projection, but even still, it's still making normal maps, baking, specular, and I've worked on games where there's no hand painting at all. So it's my preference to do hand painting, and I try and see if I can differentiate myself by doing that, because there are a lot of people who like making really realistic, really detailed, modern soldier sci-fi stuff. I think that's cool. I like playing it, but that's not really what I like making. So by being kind of a more colorful, cartoony, hand stylized, as everyone else has been moving off to the really detailed stuff, I now start to become a little bit more unique. So if there is a game doing stuff like Hungry Sharks or something else, they then are like, well, we only really know of 2 or 3 people that post a lot that have this kind of look, so that's who we're going to pay.
I guess I forgot to ask this earlier. So like, between all the time being at working for your various jobs, free time and stuff, how much of that do you spend working on your specials, like anatomy, color, drawing, etc.?
Currently 0. It's been quite a while since I've done any kind of like personal art. Right now, almost all of my hobby time, I've been learning carpentry and building a greenhouse and a storage shed, and next summer the goal is to build my own house in the Shenandoah Valley. So that's kind of been my efforts, but in the same way that photography has brought skills in, like I'm learning about architecture, how buildings are constructed, details of how you plug things in, and then that's also transferred into now how I look at things. Like Mars took us to this really awesome church that I showed you the pictures of earlier, and before I would have walked in and been like, oh, look at how beautiful it is, I like the colors, that's a cool design, but now I'm also looking at like, how is the column connected into the, and I'm interested because of my architecture hobby or my building hobby, but by constantly looking and digesting and everything, if the next time I'm tasked with making an interior space or an asset that holds things up or an environment or whatever, all this stuff is going to come in, and now my environments will potentially look more grounded in reality, because I'm not just, everything's Dr. Seuss and held up by magic. You know, I'm like, you know, okay, if something's this thick, it needs to have, you know, supports or nails or screws or whatever. So it helps you get in like that. But I think you have this very kind of line as you move through your career. So the beginning, when you're in school, I almost advise to have no life. Don't have a partner, don't date, don't go out, don't drink, don't smoke pot, just work on your art. Because what's going to happen is after school, after you get your first work, you can't do that. Real life is there. You need to work to pay the bills. You have a spouse that maybe you're married to. You have a kid that you can't just abandon. You know, you gotta take care of these things. School is, you know, a time where you can kind of delay some of these things to make the time for it. And same thing, your first year working on the job, you probably just moved to a brand new city, you probably don't have very many connections, you meet people at work, but this is a perfect time to do a lot of extra work in your free time to try and get better at that thing that you want to move into. The thing is now almost every contract job that I get, I'm doing the things that I would like to do, even if I could write down on paper my ideal job. I'm kind of doing those things, so I don't have as much motivation to like get better at this thing to be able to get paid to do it, because there aren't any things I'm not getting paid to do that I want to do. So it's this sliding scale. The further and the more established my career got, the less time I needed to spend on those extras. And I'm really glad I spent my college time with no life whatsoever and put all of my time into work. And then the first years, a little bit more life, but still very little, and working all the time on extra projects. And then as time went by and I felt my career coalescing, I was able to have more time for the external stuff. And as a benefit, I have the financial security and the higher salary and the more security at the jobs to make those other things work, because I don't have to rip my family up and move every 2 years to chase employment, or I don't have to tell my kid, like, sorry, I can't play with you because daddy has to practice hand painting hair or something like that, whereas I would have had to do that if I'd had a kid when I was 21.
Are there any websites that you recommend for networking?
Yes. So the one that, I mean, it's very different these days, but the one that was my home away from home was Polycount when I was young. All of the people who I consider, like, I wouldn't say peers, because most of them are a lot better than me, but the people who I count as like my professional friends that I count as a network are people that I met through there. I would see them post something really awesome, and I just have to talk to them, send them a private message, say like, that piece is amazing. What was your inspiration? Can we chat more on MSN or AOL or something like that? And I found most of the time, if it was someone whose aesthetic was really pleasing to me, we very often had personalities that got along well. And some of them I'm still friends with today. We talk very often. We've kind of been, we've been similar ages, so we've had kids at the same time. We've gotten more settled at the same time, and our talks have very often slowly gotten less and less about work and more about real life and families and houses and all that kind of stuff. But any kind of a site like CGTat, Polycount, CG Talk, Art Hub, these ones where they have a forum where people post, especially work in progress, and that has some kind of like community challenges. Like, okay, now we're all going to do a remake of a fighter character, or now we're going to do one of my favorite ones. We did it was to try and take a character from a Disney movie and redo them as a Kingdom Hearts character in the style of Kingdom Hearts. And so I really liked Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty. I thought she was awesome, so I'm like, okay, she's a ninja. So she's got her cat suit, and her staff is now a weapon, her crow she can send to attack. She has, this dragon-esque spine. I tried to look at, okay, what is the Kingdom Hearts style? What do I, how do I do so that it matches? So this was all for a competition, and I was able to finish in time. I had the impetus of seeing other people do the work, so I probably wouldn't have done this at all. And actually, I would say, out of all of my personal work, the majority are from competitions. This one was make a Nintendo character as a zombie Link. We had to do a Game Boy DS version of a movie character, so Inglourious Bastards. And all of these had, like, it had to be less than 1,000 triangles and up to, I don't think you had a 512. I think you could use two 256s. This was for the Kingdom Hearts challenge. And this one was based off a psychedelic dream I had, and I just had to make it. This was a challenge. This was one of the Dominance Wars. This was a challenge, make a board game character as a art. This was a Dominance War. I think this might have been a challenge, make a manga character real. This was so they used to have, this is an interesting bit of 3D history. These were called SDKs, Skin Development Kit. Because in the beginning of 3D, Quake, Wolfenstein, not everyone knew how to 3D model, and the 3D modeling programs were very difficult to get and pirate if you weren't an employee. You needed to have a physical dongle to plug into the computer to get the software to run. So you would have, for example, for every one person who could make a 3D model, you would have 10 to 20 who knew how to make textures. So you would either take a model from the game that was already texture mapped and worked, and multiple people would make the same texture for it, or one person who had access to 3D modeling would make a character, make a good UV layout, make it very generic so it could be interpreted in a lot of ways, and then put it out on these forums like Polycount and say, here's my SDK, my skin development kit, go hog wild. and it was almost like this early competition. People were like, oh, okay, I'm going to make it as a nurse, I'm going to make it as a zombie, I'm going to make it as a ninja. And then you could see this same exact model, same exact CUVs, what does it look like with different textures. So this bondage imp was based off a SDK made by Brian Jones. He goes by Bobo the Seal online. This one was a SDK put out by a Dutch woman who's a very talented artist. So a lot of my personal work has been for these challenges, and had I not participated in these challenges, I would have a lot less work on my website to show. All right. Well, thank you for, maybe I could take one more real quick one.
Yeah, other than Polycount, are there any other kind of competition sites that maybe do stuff with like concepts or environments?
Yeah, so conceptart.org does concept challenges, and they're definitely the site to go if you're a concept artist. I mean, there's really no comparison. That's where everyone who does concept art is. The Polycount does do environment challenges, not as often, but especially in the beginners forum, they do a lot of environment challenges, and it says beginners, but like anyone who's not a super experienced professional would be welcome to join. And CG Chat used to do a lot more. They started the dominance wars to begin with. And I think CG Hub also does regular competitions, but it has a lot less participation than Polycount. All right, well, thank you all for being good listeners and good questions. And good luck in your learning and your future careers.
I'm going to the pod.
Yeah, we're a little over on the first part. Aspirations are more interesting to
I'd like to.